The right to vote and voter qualifications. This is going to be about um, the expansion of voting rights through amendments and laws, and then also the requirements, the qualifications to vote, and then a couple laws that actually decreased the right to vote. The history of voting rights: suffrage equals the right to vote. So whenever you hear the word suffrage, that means the right to vote. The most famous one was women's suffrage, and that was the struggle for women to get the right to vote. At the writing of the Constitution, only white males that owned property would have the right to vote. Today, the electorate is a lot more than that. It's many more millions of people. About 220 to 230 million people are able to vote. Citizens that are 18 years or older and are U.S. citizens are the voting age population. And then we also have something voting eligible population, which we'll get to in a little bit. The growth of qualified voters is due to changes in the definition of suffrage. In other words, the more people can vote now because of laws, amendments throughout the years have changed who could vote and who could not vote. There are 5 stages of extending suffrage, first in the 1800s, early 1800s, then following the Civil War, then the 1920s, the 1960s, and then 1971. In the early 1800s, religious tests were basically you had to be a certain religion to vote, and that was struck down by states. Property ownership requirement to vote was struck down by states, and then tax payment qualifications were eliminated. So by 1850, almost all white males could vote. And then following the Civil War, which was basically over slavery, the 15th Amendment, it protected any citizen from being denied the right to vote based on race or color. Was not fully implemented until the 1960s, but there were people that voted that were African American males from like after the 15th Amendment to the 1880s, and then actually it went away through Jim Crow laws. 1920 was the 19th Amendment, prohibited denial of right to vote based on sex. Women were getting the right to vote in states in the 1880s and 1890s, 1900s, but it wasn't until 1920 that women got the right to vote, and it was permanent. Then in the 1960s, there was quite a few things. First, Washington, D.C. in 1961 got the right to vote in presidential elections. There's about 1 million people that live in D.C. that basically it's our nation's capital. It's not a state, and they could not vote. Then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, and that got rid of grandfather clauses, white primaries, other restrictions against voting against African Americans. And then we also had the 24th Amendment, which got rid of poll taxes, the requirement to pay a tax to vote. And then in 1971, the final thing where we actually increased voting was we gave young people the right to vote. So the age to vote up until this time was 21. It was decreased to 18 due to the Vietnam War, where many 18-year-olds, 19, 20-year-olds were fighting and dying in Vietnam, but they could not vote. So in 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed, and 18-year-olds could vote. So those were the big changes, the 5 stages of extending voting. To be qualified to vote for a presidential election, you must be a U.S. citizen, you must be resident of a state, and you must be 18 years or older. Other qualifications, and one that's big one, is registration. You must register in a state. The literacy and tax payments were for most of our history. We had those, but those were basically stopped in the 1970s or by the 1970s. Citizenship, technically, the Constitution doesn't even say anything about voting, doesn't say anything about aliens or citizens. States could allow individuals to vote if they chose to. And currently, right now, in school board elections, in state elections, local elections, resident aliens, people with a green card can vote. They just can't vote for the president. Only 2 states have really strict qualifications on citizenship. Minnesota, you need to be a citizen for 3 months before you can vote. And then in Pennsylvania, you need to be a citizen for at least 1 month before you can vote for the election. You need to be a resident of a state, and you must have a driver's license or some kind of proof that you live in that state. Why the residency requirement? To keep political machines from bribing enough outsiders to affect a local election, bringing people in from other states, especially when you have the Northeast with New York, Connecticut, New Jersey. It could have gotten a lot of problems. And also to allow new voters at least some time to become familiar with the candidates and issues in an area. All states prohibit transients, people that don't have an address or people that only live in a certain area for a short time from voting. Traveling salespeople, military men and women, college students can vote, but they have to basically have their permanent address in a state. They must have a permanent address, and then they would vote in that place where their permanent address is, not where they are currently living. The 26th Amendment again gave the right of citizens who are 18 years or older to vote. Cannot be denied. No state can set a minimum age higher, like 19 or 20. They can do lower, and Washington, D.C. is looking at doing that at 16. It's very sad, and unfortunately, young voters are less likely to vote than any other age group. Between 72 and 2000, the percentage of young voters fell from 48% to 28%. It's actually decreased from there. And depending on the election, it's a lot less. The presidential might be a little bit more than 28%, but it's very low. You must be registered in the state. 49 states require that you register to vote, all but North Dakota. Arizona is one where you have to, and typically it's 30 days beforehand. It's to prevent fraudulent voting, voting twice. You remain registered until you move, you die, you're convicted of a serious crime, committed to a mental institution, or if you haven't voted many times. Sometimes they'll remove you if you haven't voted in the last 3 or 4 elections. The U.S. is the only democracy in which people decide whether they are registered or not. And we've got some states like Oregon, California, that once you apply for a driver's license, you're automatically registered, but that's very rare. Typically, we give you the choice to register. Literacy is something that does make sense. We want people that can read and that can understand government and politics. We want qualified people to vote. But what's happened is it was used terribly in the South. So no state has a suffrage requirement based on literacy today. At one point, it was used to make sure voters had the capacity to vote, but it was used to prevent African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans from voting. Literacy tests required people prove that they could read or write and understand the material. They were banned as of 1970. And then tax payments. You had to pay a tax to vote, whether it was $1, 50 cents, $5, $10. It was a common practice for qualification for voting. Basically, rich people voted and the poor did not. It was basically found as a way of discouraging African Americans to vote in the South. It was used throughout the South. The 24th Amendment outlawed the poll tax as a qualification to vote. And one of the questions that I'm going to be asking you is a driver's license, getting a driver's license, a poll tax. Now in Arizona, that driver's license is $12 and you get it for 25 years. But in other states, you have to pay $25, $30, $40, $50 for that, and it's only for 4 years. Sometimes you have to get a copy of your birth certificate or some other things. So, and those could cost money. So is getting a driver's license a poll tax? That's a very interesting question. People who are denied the right to vote, and these are citizens. These are people that are 18 years or older, people found mentally incompetent or in mental institutions. Some states deny the right to vote to anybody who has ever committed a serious crime. That would be like for a felony, it's a serious crime. And sometimes, obviously, I think most Americans agree if you're in jail for a felony, you shouldn't be able to vote. Maybe if you are on probation, but typically after you've served your time, served your probation, most people think that those people should be able to vote. Well, in some southern states, they can't vote. My nephew is, I think, 32, 33 years old. He committed a felony, was younger. He's been out. He's gone through probation. He's clean. He doesn't do drugs, doesn't do anything bad anymore, and he still can't vote in the state of Virginia. A few states do not allow anyone who is dishonorably discharged from voting in the military. So those are the people that are denied to vote. And that is the voting eligible population, anybody 18 years or older who are basically U.S. citizens, but then who are not one of these mentally incompetent, whether they have committed felon or they're dishonorably discharged. Those are the voting age population. So hopefully this made sense. If you have any questions, feel free to ask when we have class, or you can post anything for questions in the comments. Thank you so much.